Well, I know people will be joining us as we go, so we'll get started now. Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to be bringing this webinar to you. Praxis Australia, together with the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jo Perdue, Professional Officer of Professional Services at the Association. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, Sally, and really looking forward to tonight. So my name's Jo Perdue. I'm a professional officer with the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, and look after all things professional around professional development, professional practice, but also I look after the professional education portfolio. And tonight is come about with partnering with Praxis Australia in looking at promoting and encouraging people to look into clinical trials and research and those aspects of nursing, because we found that there seems to be a real shortage in this area in regards to nurses wanting to develop themselves, but even an understanding around the processes and some of the modules that you and things that you need to know and understand. So Praxis is an organisation we've decided to help us promote that type of education, and they have some really great modules and learning resources. So this is an introduction for you to be able to ask some of those questions tonight, and we've got a great panel here in front of us that will be providing all those answers, I hope. So yeah, I'm really thankful for that, and we'll be hopefully bringing you more of this type of stuff in the future. So thanks again to Praxis, and I'll hand it back to Sally.
Thank you, Jo. We'd like to start firstly with the acknowledgement of Australia's First Nations peoples as the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands that we live on and work on, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay respect to their elders, past, present and future. I'd like now to just talk about a couple of housekeeping things. As you all know, the session's in webinar format, so your mic should be set to mute and your camera is off for the duration of the webinar. There will be question time at the end of the session, time permitting, but feel free to post your questions throughout. Please do so through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or in your toolbar, maybe at the top of your screen. If we don't get to all of the questions at the end of the session, our panelists will do their best to answer these offline, and we will then go ahead and share that with you. There's going to be a very short survey at the end. In fact, we will send that out tomorrow, and we ask that you complete this. I know some of you will be interested in using this to have a certificate at the end, and we're certainly going to issue a certificate at the end of the session that you can use for CPD purposes. Okay, so I'd like to start by introducing Praxis Australia, where Praxis was founded in 2015. It's an independent NFP and charity, and Praxis was created as a collaborative social enterprise by its member organisations, who are the University of Sydney, Bellbury Limited and Monash University, via another NGO, which is Global Reconciliation. Praxis Australia provides education and training to the research, ethics and clinical trials sectors across Australia and in other regions, including New Zealand, PNG and other expanding regions globally. Our mission is to promote excellence in research practice through education and training, and you'll see on screen some of the examples of our training modules, and some of you may already be familiar with those. So what are we going to do in the next hour? We've got a short time, and I'd just like to put this up here. What we're hoping to achieve is to introduce you to the purpose and role of clinical trials in improving health outcomes for all. We know this is a growing area of interest for nurses and midwives. And we're also wanting to deepen your understanding of the key role that you as nurses and midwives play in supporting clinical trials and as being the backbone of clinical trials in Australia. So now I would like to take the opportunity to welcome and introduce our wonderful panelists. Well, first of all, I'm I guess, Sally Armstrong, the Strategic Alliances Partner for Praxis Australia. I'm not part of the panel, but I'm helping to host the session. Our panelists are Nicola Strayton, Kelly Beer, and Melanie Jenkel. We have a very experienced panel, and they have all been clinical research nurses. They're joining us to share, and some of them still are, to share their experiences and provide you with some really key insights into the role of the CRN. You can see there, Nicola Strayton is a registered nurse, project and engagement manager of Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, and she's held some very significant roles in the clinical research sector for over a decade. She's working currently as the project and engagement manager at the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, the peak body for investigator-led trials across Australia. I'll let you go on to read more about Nicola, and I'm sure she'll tell us as well. We have Kelly Beer, who is also a registered nurse, clinical research manager at Myositis Discovery Program at the Perrin Institute for Neurological and Translation Science. Kelly is the clinical research manager for this program, and Kelly has been working in clinical research for more than 14 years, doing a whole range of things, coordinating research projects involving patient groups and healthy volunteers. Among other things, she's worked at Cambridge in the UK as the lead research nurse at the National Institute for Health Research, and has done many other interesting things in her career. And Melanie Jenkel, who is our CEO at Praxis Australia, who has spent the last 25 years of her career within the Australian clinical trials environment across many different roles. Melanie has been pivotal in really putting an emphasis on the whole role of clinical trials and the importance of clinical trials in Australia, and certainly is seen as the face of Praxis. Many of you may have seen Melanie before and have had perhaps some interactions with her. So that is our terrific panel, and we'd like to get started now. Firstly, we're going to open this with a poll to make the session a bit interactive from the get-go, and also to give our panel some insight into who you are. So starting with the first poll question, I'd like to ask how familiar you are with the role and purpose of clinical trials. I'm going to launch the poll. Here we are. Here we are. You'll see that there's a poll on the screen there. You have the opportunity to input into that, get your results in. There are 3 options to answer that question. Okay, terrific. We still have some of the answers coming in. And we can see, I will share those results. Majority are somewhat familiar with the role and purpose of clinical trials, which is what we anticipated. Joe, can I ask, are you any comments on those results?
I would say that's probably, I think most nurses sort of have a basic foundation of, know that clinical trials is about research and those sort of things. But I would say that probably is a fairly true picture of what most people in the profession think. Yeah.
Great. And one of the key reasons that we're doing this seminar and the great interest in it. So now I'd just like to go to the next poll question, which is, have you ever been involved in a clinical trial personally or professionally? So I'm just going to launch this poll. And you should see that coming up on your screen now. We've got 4 options for that poll. Okay, and sharing the results here. Again, I don't think any surprises there. Kelly and Nick, is this what you expected of the group?
I think so. I think until you realise it's all around you, you
Yes.
don't think you've been exposed or taken part in it.
Yeah,
I agree. And it's just great. There's such an appetite to know more. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And we hope that will move the bar a little bit with this intro session and pique your interest to continue to learn more. So just moving on, I'd now like to hand over to Melanie to give some background to the conversation as a place setter. Over to you, Melanie.
Okay, thanks, Sally, and again, on behalf of Praxis, welcome to you all, and especially to our panelists, Kelly and Nick, and to Joe for making this opportunity possible. It's certainly been a very interesting time for clinical trials in Australia, and never been more apparent that the awareness of bringing clinical trials to our nursing workforce is a really key priority for the sector. So I'm going to turn my camera off quickly while I go through some of this information. But let me just preface it by saying all we can do in this very brief session is to really give you a taster of what clinical trials are and the role of the clinical research nurse, because we really want to focus on hearing from our panelists and hearing about their experience. And the whole aim of that is to try and encourage you to think about clinical trials as a career pathway for yourselves. So let's get started. So what are clinical trials? And what you can see on the screen is the World Health Organization definition. It's very cold and it's very clinical, but really in its essence, clinical trials are about the kinds of things that we do every day as nurses. So every treatment we administer, every standard of care that we adhere to, every action we take to ensure best practice care for our patients is the result of research, and none of that will be surprising to any of you. But clinical trials themselves are more structured, and they're more structured and governed research that takes a new treatment or a therapy, and that can be a device or a medication or a new way of delivering care, from the bench to the patient in a safe and ethically robust way. Clinical trials, as opposed to research more generally, involve humans, and their participation is obviously critical. Without research participants, be they patients with known conditions or healthy volunteers that help us in those very first stages of clinical trial investigations, without them, progress and innovation simply isn't possible. Next slide. Thanks, Sally. But for all new interventions being studied, there is a very defined and well-described pathway. And what you see on screen is something that's very familiar to all of us as clinical trialists, but may not be as obvious to many of you at the bedside that are administering treatments to patients. So this whole phase of development that begins with phase 1, with a very small number of people involved, is where we are giving treatments to people for the very first time. It could be a brand new class of medication or device, or it could be a known class of medication or device given to a different population of people. But these are the very early investigations. And in phase 1 trials, what we are trying to do is just determine if the product is safe. We then go right through the clinical trials pathway into phase 3 trials, and they're the largest clinical trials that involve hundreds to thousands of people that are conducted across the globe. And the whole purpose of those bigger later phase studies, which is what we call them, is about determining safety on a large scale, but more importantly, efficacy. And once medications or treatments get to phase 3, they then go through a regulatory approval process. And what you're seeing on the screen here is the US reflection of regulatory process, which is governed by the FDA. In Australia, it's the TGA, who's our regulator. And that's at that stage is where traditionally drugs and treatments then become available to patients. But one of the things that we've seen recently in response to COVID-19 is a real shortening of this development phase. And this is, again, not news to any of you, in that we've now seen drugs that have gone only through the phase 1 experimental phase being fast-tracked through the approvals process and into humans because of the pure nature of the emergency situation that we face. So that is fraught with complications and fraught with being open to risks of safety, particularly to patients. And we've seen some of that through the kinds of adverse events that we've seen through some of the vaccines. But actually research shows us, and that's the importance of research in clinical trials, is reflecting back on some of that information, that actually it's not that unusual in the populations that they've been studied. And so that's where research in clinical trials plays an important role in really building a body of evidence that then helps us to take treatments and innovations to our patients at the bedside. Next slide. Thanks, Sally. I wanted to just share this screen with you, particularly given that many of you are quite new to clinical trials, because I wanted you to get a sense of the complexity of the whole life cycle of clinical trials. So it goes right from when we first have an idea about designing or a new product that could potentially save people's lives or change their lives dramatically, right through from when we start enrolling patients to the final stages where we actually release that information into publication. This whole process takes somewhere between 15 years historically. Normally costs anywhere from around 15 million as a starting point to much more. But one of the things, again, that we've seen is that COVID has shown us where there are efficiencies that we can make along this time frame. And what's important there is it means that we get treatments to our patients much quicker, and that we can improve the health outcomes of individuals, of groups, but also the society more generally through clinical trial advancements. Next slide. Thanks, Sally. So the main purpose of why we are here today is to talk about the role of the clinical research nurse and the opportunities that exist for nurses who are looking to or are thinking about exploring a career pathway in clinical trials. And there are many people that could be fit for purpose for these roles, but we believe that that nurses make the ideal professionals to work in this area. You're clinical specialists. You have highly honed observation and clinical execution skills. By virtue of what you do, you are patient advocates, and your patients come first. And that's a really important emphasis when we're thinking about clinical trials. You have expertise in bench to bedside practice. You know the impacts that new treatments and innovations can bring to your patients. So you're already advocates for research, even without possibly knowing it. You're great time managers. That's a given. As nurses, we are constantly juggling competing demands. You're complex problem solvers. No 2 days are ever the same in nursing. No 2 patients are ever the same, and no disease presentation or indication is ever the same as well. So we're constantly being challenged by the problems that we are faced with every day in our practice. And you're expert communicators. You're well trained in being able to establish relationships very quickly with your patients and your peers. And that's a really important skill when we're talking about clinical trials. But I think most importantly, we are the most trusted profession in the world, and we have been for many years in surveys that are done around the globe around which professions the public trust the most. And I don't think that's ever been more important, particularly from a clinical trials perspective, given that there has been anxiety related to the clinical trials that have been undertaken throughout this whole pandemic experience. And I think nurses are well placed to really help reduce that anxiety and reassure our patients and our trial participants. So that's really the intro in a nutshell. And Sally, I'll throw back to you now so that we can have a chat with our panelists and get some insight from them and their experiences.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melanie, for that excellent overview of the role of the clinical research nurse. We're now going to go to some questions, put a couple of questions for the panel, and really to get the inside story on some of the areas we've talked about already. The first question I'd like to put to you, Nicola, and ask if you can tell us about your background and involvement as a nurse in research and clinical trials.
Great, thanks, Sally, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. I think it's super awesome. So everyone on the panel, I think there's a few of us who are super nerds in research, if not all of us. So it's good to be here amongst friends and hopefully new friends. So yeah, my background is as a nurse, but specializing in cardiology. And I think I probably got into it because I like squiggly careers. So I think I listened to that recently on a TED talk and it really fitted me. So I don't know why I didn't use it when I was 15 and deciding on a career choice. So I got into it because, I guess linking back to what you just said, I got into nursing because I really want to care for people and I want to give the best care for people. So as a nurse, when you're a new nurse or midwife, as you all know, you start off absolutely terrified and you follow whatever it says in your nursing care sheets or the pathways that we all follow, which is great. And then you get a few years of experience and you suddenly realize that that care pathway or the care plan doesn't actually fit all the patients you care for. So when you start digging into, okay, where did this care plan come from? You start to look at the evidence. And when you start to look at the evidence and evidence-based care, which I think is in all of our competencies, you start to think, okay, so this is how this evidence came about. And when you start digging deeper into that, you realize that that evidence came about through research and often through the highest quality research, which is clinical trials. So I kind of got into it because I don't always take what is read on a piece of paper when I'm nursing. So it was quite exciting. I did it, and I'm sure you're going to hear from others in this panel. I fell into it. Someone was going on maternity leave, a cardiovascular nurse on a ward that I worked on. And I just thought she looked cool. When I realized she wasn't walking around with a clipboard taking the sandwich order, I realized that she was actually a research nurse. And so she let me shadow her for a little while. And it was really interesting just seeing, I guess, the autonomy that you have as a research nurse, the level of expertise that you have to have those very short conversations, basically discussing with patients and family members why research may be suitable for them, why they may want to consider participating, and why it links to their disease. And it's a difficult conversation to have with some patients. You know, we have this research, would you like to take part? We're doing it because we don't know the answers. Being able to navigate that, as Mel said, expert communicators is part of our skills. So yeah, I kind of fell into it, but it led to a beautiful squiggly career path. So I then started off in London in a cardiovascular trials unit, moved to Australia 8 years ago. I'm still practicing my accent, but I'm sure it will come. To which I then moved into intensive care research, which was a whole other world in itself. So new drugs, new devices, but also everyday care. So looking at what we do every single day, for example, in intensive care, I'm sure several of you have a background, you know, do you give steroids for people who have sepsis, or do you just give them nothing, and which one's best? And really looking at that everyday care made me realize that nurses in research are a real integral part of it. It led me on to running my own clinical trials unit, just as I think Kelly's doing now or has done. And to have that autonomy and growth as a nurse is pretty exciting. So for me, it led me into working in policy nursing now, but also wanting to do my own research. I don't have any children, but I do have a puppy, so I can commit my time to research. But I'm even doing my own PhD now and looking at heart valve disease and asking those questions, you know, how can we improve outcomes for patients and their family members, and what's new, you know, thinking about digital health opportunities and involving patients in research. So that's kind of my story. I fell into it, but it's opened up a beautiful hole.
Thank you, Nicola, for elaborating on the squiggly career. That's terrific. The next question I'd like to put to you, Kelly. Can you talk about what your pathway was into clinical trials as a clinical research nurse, including some of the barriers and the enablers?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And it's really exciting to be able to talk here about a specialty that I'm really passionate about, and Mel and Nick and everyone online as well. And, you know, it's great to start shining the light on this career path for nurses. So I think those of us who follow it really become quite strong advocates for what it can offer. So I guess very, very similar to Nick, I ended up falling into a clinical research nurse career path. So I first got into clinical research nursing. You have to excuse me, I might have a small person invade my screen in a minute. I first got into clinical research nursing when I moved over to the UK. So I'd been working in Sydney at Prince of Wales Hospital in emergency nursing. All right, come say hi and then go. All right, see you. Sorry, guys. I could just tell that was going to happen. All right, thank you. See you later, Sammy. Off you go, honey. Sorry, you gotta love the balance of life and parenting. Okay, off you go. Sorry, guys. That was absolutely going to happen. So yeah, when I moved over to the UK, I was essentially looking for a job that was a little bit different, that might give me a little bit better of a work-life balance, and probably 80% driven by wanting to do something that was really around primary health promotion and around making a difference, in that same feeling that Nick really identified of questioning and, you know, just wanting to improve care for people, and probably 20% driven by a job that was 9 to 5 and Monday to Friday, because that is one of the benefits sometimes of working outside of, you know, the acute clinical setting as well. So I really just found an opportunity, and because I guess I was in a new country, I was open to doing that. I certainly found that it was a really big learning curve. You know, there wasn't a lot of support, there wasn't a lot of training. It was really all on the job. As I moved into management roles within my research nursing career, I guess we'd look and see what it was like for people who were trying to move over from clinical pathways into clinical research nursing. And certainly there are huge barriers in awareness of the specialty, in access to any kind of experience or training within the specialty. So we'd often have nurses who would want to move in, but when we had job descriptions or adverts that asked for previous experience in research, that would be a real challenge for how do you get that. And I know as someone who would do recruiting, you know, we often just used to really try and find people who are passionate about trying the specialty and about making a difference, because so much of the training would be on the job. I think when you look at enablers, you know, it's a bit of a self-selecting group, I think, research nurses. generally research nurses, like all nurses really, are people who are passionate about making a difference, who are questioning, who want to perhaps do something different and have quite a diverse career. It's certainly a specialty where you can end up putting on a number of different hats, everything from specialist nurse to project manager to, you know, travel agent, anything you want, you end up doing it all. And I think we're really good at that as nurses. So our skill set that we train with just is so adaptable into clinical research nursing. So I think once you're in the specialty and once you kind of get your foot in the door, it's, you know, it's addictive, it's dynamic, it's really supportive when you do get into it and meet the others and you know, research nursing friends and research nursing nerds. It's great to have that network. But I think certainly the fence is high. You know, you've got to kind of really have some support, or we need to try and find ways to make it a much more accessible specialty and pathway for people. So it's great to start this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. I can certainly see the passion in you and Nick. And my third question to Melanie, I know Melanie is absolutely passionate about this area. So Melanie, over to you. Why is it so important that we encourage nurses and midwives to think about clinical trials as a career pathway? And why is this especially important now?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And I guess reflecting on what Nick and Kelly have said, you know, typically nurses continue to fall into clinical trials rather than it being a determined decision and a career pathway for them. And that's a real challenge, and it's certainly a barrier. And what we want to try to be doing is thinking about how can we overcome that barrier and how can we turn that into an enabler. And from an Australian clinical trials perspective, we are globally recognised for our excellence. We are recognised for the quality of our data, for the rapidness and the robustness of our regulatory systems. And we've always been a very attractive place to conduct clinical trials. But what COVID has done has actually shone the spotlight on Australia. And whilst that's an incredibly positive thing, and we've seen a huge amount of investment directed to Australia in the way of clinical trials, what's happened and was already happening actually before COVID was we know we are facing an incredible skills gap. And it's across a number of areas of the clinical trials workforce, but none more importantly than the role of a clinical trial coordinator. And those roles are traditionally supported by nurses who transition from clinical care into clinical trials. And our ability to actually meet that competitive advantage, so the fact that COVID-19 has really not impacted the way we conduct business, the way that we deliver healthcare in Australia, compared to other regions where clinical trials happen, does present us with a big opportunity, but also it really highlights that skills gap that is very evident now. And without meeting that skills gap, it means that it doesn't matter how much investment we put into Australia and into our clinical trials infrastructure, we will not be able to support the high quality clinical trials that we are renowned for. And nurses just provide, as I mentioned before, that really key skill set and a very easy transition into practice. But what we have to do is recognise what the barriers are. Those barriers exist at an institutional level. They exist at an academic level where we haven't recognised the importance of building awareness and education and training for nurses as they undertake their fundamental training, but also when they are practicing as nurses in the clinical setting, understanding that clinical trials is a career pathway for them. So one of the things that we are collectively very passionate about, and there's been a question come up from Reg around the lack of acknowledgement of clinical trials as a career pathway for nurses. And it is something that we are heavily passionate about agitating for. So we do need to be speaking to our regulators about recognition of nurses. We also need to be speaking to our academic sectors about increasing and improving the way that we provide education to our future nurses around clinical trials. And this tonight is just one way of chipping away at building that awareness, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Melanie. That question really is a bit of a segue into the next question that I'd like to put to you, Nick, and that is really looking at the whole area of barriers and how we can improve and reduce the barriers. And one of those ways, I guess, is how are clinical trials actively promoting inclusivity and diversity and embracing this? And why is this important? How can the nurses and midwives play an active role in this?
Thank you. Tough pass. No, this is a really, really good and a really important question. So the first part of it, how are clinical trials actively promoting better inclusivity and diversity? Look, to be honest, I don't think they historically have been. And I think we're all recognizing this now. And COVID again has shone a light on the lack of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. So I think all of us know in Australia and in different countries where we may come from, there's a lot of people out there from different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different age groups who are worse off since COVID has happened. And that's for a multitude of complex reasons, as we know. But I think in clinical trials, one of the big recognitions through the pandemic was that they need to be more inclusive and diverse. And so I think that there are active steps now, and the FDA, just as Mel was saying before, who are the regulatory body in the US, they took this quite seriously during developing the vaccines. And so they actually pushed the people who developed the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, as many of you know, to look at how they can include more people from diverse backgrounds. And I think, just to give you a bit of an example of stark numbers, in clinical trials, I think for the last decade in the US, around about the total sample, around about 4% of people in a sample were Black Americans or African Americans, and even less were from Asian American backgrounds. So during the development of the COVID vaccine, clinical trials were set a target as you have to increase this up to 10%. And so this is where they worked with all health professionals, nurses, midwives, to look at how can we make clinical trials, make people more aware of clinical trials, how can we find people to take part in clinical trials, or even offer it as a solution for them. So I think they are pushing the boundaries. And I think with nurses and midwives, what's our role in this? Well, I think just again, as what Kelly and Mel were saying, we spend the most time with patients as a profession, and we're the most trusted profession. So we have to, I think, increase our literacy around clinical trials and research and try and bring that to a conversation with our patients and their families. So I think it's about really starting those conversations. And Kelly's just about to publish a paper in a couple of months talking about how to increase diversity in clinical trials. I think, nurses, we are in this trusted profession, but I think one of the things, again, the Black Lives Matter movements and certainly COVID has taught us is that we need to be aware of our own biases. So in research and how can we play an active role, we need to recognize, who are we leaving behind, or who are we not engaging with as effectively as we could be. There's a fantastic paper which talks about the good study patients. And the good study patient is often Caucasian, has a high health literacy level, maybe more socioeconomically stable than most of us. So that's a good study patient. But who's left behind? Who are we leaving behind? Is it the older people? Is it people from ethnic backgrounds who don't understand the traditional Western health model? So I think nurses were super cool at figuring out these complex solutions and often advocating for patients' rights. So all we have to do is translate that into research and say, hey, should this patient from African American backgrounds, should they be offered the opportunity to take part in research and in clinical trials? And I think once you start to understand that journey, it's easy to start, I think, pushing the boundaries a little bit more. So I think that's how we can do it, kind of having the conversation, understanding it ourselves, and really raising awareness of research.
Great. Thank you, Nick. My next question really, I guess, expands on this idea of better understanding those involved. And this, Kelly, I'd like to put this to you. And this is a term I've heard a lot in my time with Praxis, that clinical trials have become much more patient-centric. What does this mean, and how does this relate to nursing and midwifery as a profession? And isn't healthcare always patient-centric? Kelly, can you answer that one for us, please?
Yeah, they're great questions. Hopefully I won't be interrupted by little people this time. I think we were saying earlier that these terms, they can really get overused, I guess, and we're used to, you're right, healthcare, nursing is always patient-centered. There's no doubt about that. Everything we do is centered around the people that we look after. But I think in clinical trials, historically, there has been a view more of clinical trials participants. So, even the terminology that used to be used of subjects is common, and we're still sort of fighting the wave there, particularly where research has been based in laboratories. Sometimes, it can be seen, samples are seen as commodities rather than necessarily coming from people. We've seen data often used and taken advantage of by groups as well. So, you only have to look even through recent history at the use of informed consent for research, and, where patients or research participants haven't always been given choice about how and when they engage with research. And I think clinical research nurses have made a big impression here and done a lot of work in making sure that the way we conduct research, just like the way we conduct healthcare, is really about and for and with our patients, our participants, that they're not just sort of part of, the source of our samples or the source of our data, but actually partners in healthcare. And it's a really interesting thing in research, because all of a sudden, I think, from my perspective anyway, we often have this real partnership with our research participants, because it's not just a very one-way system with healthcare that it often is, that we're providing a service to patients and they're reliant on that service. And actually, if they don't like what we're doing, or they're not too sure if we're doing things the right way, sometimes they feel they don't necessarily have a voice, because they need us and they need the service we're providing. With research, we're having this real give and take. We're getting samples, data, information from participants that is critical to our research, and equally they're getting a lot of different things back. A lot of research participants are really very altruistically driven, but sometimes there are other drivers for research participation as well. But it really means that it ends up being quite a partnership as well. And I think nurses are really quite central in acknowledging that in the research dynamic and in prioritising that. So some of the really simple things that you might do as a research nurse is actually take a research visit out to someone's home rather than having them come into the hospital, or make sure that the information sheet you're giving them is actually understandable and it's not so full of jargon and heavy that they can't read it and make sense of what you're trying to do. So it is really that kind of translation of research to something that the patient can engage with, that is really reflecting what they want to get out of it as well. So I think we do have a different opportunity within research to really have patients as partners, our research participants as partners, and it's one of the things that I really love about the specialty as well. I don't know if I answered the question, but
I think you did, absolutely, Kelly. Thank you. And one of the things you said, picking up on I guess the motivations of patients, and the fact that often those motivations are altruistic, but there are other drivers that we need to recognize, and motivations behind why patients are entering clinical trials, and the need to protect. And this really leads into my next question. Melanie, I'd like to put my next question to you. And this is really asking what safeguards are in place to protect those involved in clinical trials. And also the second part of that question is how bureaucratic and paternalistic is our current approach?
Yeah, look, and again, I just wanted to quickly reflect back on what Kelly said, and actually the resource toolkit that Nick has put in the chat function there. So the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance is really a key body in Australia for promoting excellence in clinical trials in the investigator-led sector, where actually a lot of clinical trials is conducted in Australia, although it's typically funded by industry. That's the greatest amount of income that we generate is through industry-sponsored research. But the changes in practice are driven by investigator-led research. And so ACT has done some great work around patient involvement. So if you want to get a feel for what that means like in a research context, I would absolutely recommend that you look at those resources. And just going back to what Kelly said, I think one of the exciting things about being in clinical trials is that it's an industry that has really engaged with and very heavily connected with the role of the patient being an active participant. And it's a really exciting place to be in, because some of those changes are transitioning then into the way that we think about designing and delivering healthcare, not just from a research perspective, but in a more holistic way as well. So in regards to the safeguards, so look, I'll be fairly brief here because there are a few questions that we'd like to get to. But there are lots of checks and balances along the way. There are international guidelines that really mandate the way that we conduct and manage our clinical research practice. Some of these are absolutely compulsory, and they are built into the kinds of training that any clinical research professional will need to undertake. And then there are other roles of other stakeholders and regulatory bodies, but importantly, human research ethics committees. And one of the things that I'd encourage anyone on the call today, if you're thinking about clinical trials but aren't sure, but would like to get a better sense of what the whole pathway looks like, institutions across the country convene human research ethics committees. There are over 250 human research ethics committees across Australia, and they are always looking for volunteers to have a role on those committees. I have to say, I got into human research ethics committee practice over a decade now, and it enhanced my practice as a clinical trials professional in ways that I can't even measure. Just being able to look at different disciplines, being able to look at different research questions, but also being able to frame it from an ethical perspective. So I'd encourage people on the call today to think about joining a human research ethics committee as another extension of your practice. From that paternalistic approach and the bureaucratic approach, yes, there is a lot of bureaucratic red tape involved in clinical trials. Much of it is necessary because it is about keeping our participants safe and protecting their safety and welfare and their rights. So much of it we wouldn't want to see thrown out. But the move to patient-centric driven research is really minimalising that paternalistic approach, because patients are now involved in determining what are the right questions for which groups of people and at what time. And that's really changing the relationship and the responsibility from the regulators back to the patients. So again, it's a really exciting time, and we're seeing a huge shift in that paternalistic approach to the oversight of research.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melanie. We do have a number of questions that are from the audience, and our panelists have been busy while doing this also answering those, so thank you very much. And we will get to those. Before I do, I'd just like to finally, just to sum up with some final reflections from the panel on why choose a clinical research nursing or midwifery career and how to get involved. So Can I ask you, Nicola, for your thoughts on that?
Why choose it? Because it's super fun. And you get to meet a lot of cool people and hang out with patients more. How to get involved? I love the first poll questions. I would challenge you all to see tomorrow if you can go and find a clinical research nurse or midwife and make friends with them and have a cup of tea. And if you see their face light up like you do the nerds on this webinar, that might tell you how to get involved.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. Kelly, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to go and find. We're always so excited if people come and ask us about the specialty list. And I think if you are someone who really enjoys autonomy in your nursing roles, if you find yourself, wanting to know how you can improve care, and yeah, really being driven to ask questions and see what difference you make. It's a great and really rewarding specialty. So, and I think great way. There's a lot of resources I can see that have already been shared, and I think will be available. But definitely, that's a fantastic way just to get involved, is make a research nurse friend, and you've got us as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Any others, Melanie or Joe? Would you like to add to that, or just if not, we'll just move on to the audience questions.
I was just gonna say, I think this is just by looking at some of the questions that maybe we can look at putting some stuff together for people to answer those questions on what to do if they're really interested in getting into clinical trials, because I think that's really important to sort of know the steps of where to go or who to speak to or where do you really look. Because I mean, I personally, it was like, where would you start to even look for your clinical trials nurse in a hospital? I suppose I know it's a great what you said, but I think some people are probably really keen by the look of the response in some of the chats that I've been reading, that maybe we can work at putting something together with you guys that we can sort of put out.
Look for the office that has no windows and a book. And we're probably in there.
in the furthest in the broom closet.
Yeah.
Every specialty within every institution will have a clinical trials arm bedded to it. So ask your unit managers, ask your clinicians. People are, very excited and passionate about clinical research and will welcome you warmly. So you just need to ask some questions and find who the right people are. Speak to your HREC committee, speak to your research governance office. They all exist within the institutions within which you work.
Great, thank you. We have probably enough time before we wrap up just for one question. I think a lot of them have been answered anyway, but one of the questions at the top of the list is from Reg, and that is there a possibility of establishing an Australian Association for Clinical Research Nurses? I'm not aware of any associations established in Australia. Melanie, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, look, it's actually a question, Reg, that the three of us on the panel have been very passionately exploring, and we've actually done some work over the last few months about what that could look like. So we are building our thoughts around building such a network. We would invite anybody who has an interest in being involved to join us. It doesn't exist in Australia, Reg, you're right, and it's a real missing piece of the puzzle. And if we want to build skills and capability, we must build those resources. So please reach out, watch this space. We will, through Joe, come back and do some more education sessions. And of course, there's other education that's available. But this is a really good channel, I think, for us to be able to keep you engaged and involved and aware of what's happening.
Fantastic. Thanks, Melanie. We probably do have time for one other, and this is a follow-on question. Will clinical research nursing potentially be acknowledged as a nursing specialty Australia-wide, perhaps by APRA? What are your thoughts on that, panel? Kelly, can I ask you to comment on that one?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, a piece of work that again, I think a lot of clinical research nurses are passionate about and would be happy to drive towards. There is an International Association of Clinical Research Nurses, IACRN, which is a US-based organisation primarily. They do have some global reach. And they have been successful in the US having the ANA over there accept clinical research nursing as a specialty and acknowledge that, and they're just working at the moment on a board certification, which is their structure within their nursing profession over there. So listen, it's always great when there's precedent. It's been driven by clinical research nurses advocating for their specialty, so I think we know that that's got to be the pathway here. And yeah, as Mel said, would welcome anyone joining that conversation, I think, to pursue it. So hopefully that's where we'd love to be, that at university it's a specialty that's up there along with your wound care specialist nurses, theatre nurses, everything else.
Fantastic. We do have a number of other questions we won't have an opportunity to answer during this webinar, but we promise we will follow up and get some answers to those remaining questions. And really, I'd really like to sincerely thank our fantastic panel members for this interesting and illuminating discussion. Melanie Gentgle, Nicholas Strayton, and Kelly Beer, and also joined by Joe Perdue, who was really the person whose question brought this all together initially. So thank you all. I think you've gone a long way into starting to demystify some of the questions about how people can take the next step into this. We've also, throughout this webinar, there have been a number of resources shared, and we will certainly go about making those available. I've also had a couple of questions about the recording. That recording will be available, and we will be following up in the next day or so with a little survey, really, to get your insight into this webinar and also what you would like to see going forward. This is the first of what we hope will be a number of webinars and a strong working relationship with the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association. And we really would like to encourage you all to be very active participants in that. I think that's really all from me. Melanie, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, again, Sally, thanks to you for facilitating and doing such a wonderful job of that. Thanks to the audience for joining us on an evening when you could be sitting in front of your television or reading a book or doing something else. I do have my glass of wine next to me. Thank you, Joe, for making this possible, for really advocating for the nurses who are your members. And we really do welcome you all to further discussions, because there is so much work to be done and so much opportunity. And as you can tell, we're all very passionate, and we just are excited about bringing passionate people into the fold.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And we will certainly be following up with you. So this is not the last you'll hear from us. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you as well. Really appreciated it, and it's been a really great session. So from the association's point of view, I think it answered and got some definitely different avenues of where we can provide some more information for people and support them if this is the career journey they'd like. So thank you again for all of you. It's been really appreciated.
And we will get to everybody's questions as well offline. So I can see that there's a couple of questions. Erin, I've noted all your questions, and we will definitely come back to you collectively and respond.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Go and enjoy your evening.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.